Good afternoon, everyone, uh, and greetings to those who are joining us online. We have a very good session where we will have two keynote addresses. And before we do that, I want to introduce myself, and I will also want my co-moderator to come up and introduce himself, to the group, both who are joining us online through Facebook and those of us who are here. I'm Professor Isabel Apa-Opiri. I'm currently the Vice Chancellor of the University of Blantyre Synod, and I also lead in a rural congregation in Zomba. It's Chigwa congregation. Before I turned 65, I was working for the World Council of Churches. So what I've described is my retirement job. Right. I worked for the World Council of Churches for 10 and a half years as Deputy General Secretary, responsible for public witness and diaconia. And so, as it was mentioned in the morning, I feel honored that, I was part of the beginning of the preparations, for this conference. So for me, it's a dream come true, to come here and witness us together, working on this. And I would like to invite my co-moderator to introduce himself to.
Good afternoon. My name is Rainer Kiefer. I'm a pastor and I'm a theologian, and I'm serving as director or general secretary of the Association of Protestant Churches and Mission, which has its offices in Hamburg. And it's a great joy for me to co-work this afternoon with Professor Piri. And it's an honor for me, and I'm looking very much forward to the next 90 minutes.
Thank you. So as we said at the beginning, we have two presentations. So it's an honor for me to introduce to you Professor Hulisani Ramatswana, who is the first one to give us a presentation. And my co-moderator is going to introduce the second presenter when their time comes. Okay. So Professor Hulisani Ramatswana is a professor of Old Testament at the University of South Africa, where he also serves as the head of the Department of Biblical and Ancient Studies. His research interest encompasses a wide range of areas with a particular focus on decolonialization, imperial dynamics, decolonial interpretations, the Hebrew Bible, and biblical theology. His work also focuses on African biblical hermeneutics, which explores the use of African knowledge systems as essential tools for interpreting biblical text. Additionally, he is dedicated to the decolonization of translated Bibles, aiming to restore the integrity of indigenous languages and cultures. He serves as the chief editor of the journal Old Testament Essays and is also involved in the Biblical Review Project with the Bible Society of South Africa. Furthermore, he also serves as pastor at the Light Reformed Community Church in Pretoria, Sunnyside, South Africa. And his presentation, the title is Colonial Dynamics and the Impoverishment of Africa 140 years after the Berlin Conference. So over to you, Professor.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be here and to have this opportunity to make this presentation. As an African, how do I genuinely reflect on the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 in light of Africa's current stark and complex situation? After 140 years after the Berlin Conference or the Congo Conference, no African country is classified among the developed countries of the world except for the Seychelles, which is an island nation with a population of just 132,000 people. The issue of poverty is particularly acute in Africa, with 438.6 million people living in extreme poverty. This is not just numbers. It represents the daily struggles of individuals and families who face a lack of basic necessities such as food, clean water, electricity, housing, sanitation, and healthcare, among other things. In the Congo Basin, especially the Democratic Republic of Congo, once a focal point of colonial ambitions, approximately 73.5% of the population finds itself entrenched in extreme poverty. Jeffrey Sachs' prophetic proclamation in his book, The End of Poverty, which was published in 2005, that poverty could end by 2025, has unfortunately not come true. Moreover, the continent continues to grapple with conflicts and wars. Nations like Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Libya are embroiled in turmoil, contributing to widespread suffering and displacement. The recurring pattern of coup d'etats in the Sahel region illustrates a concerning trend of political instability. The African continent is a paradox, a place rich in cultures, history, and natural resources, and yet entrapped and burdened by the systematic challenges that drive individuals to seek escape. Many risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean Sea, hoping to discover a better future elsewhere, away from the trials they face in Africa. This is not to say that there are no positive stories that are emerging from Africa. They are there, and they are many. Indeed, but the reality remains. Africa is underdeveloped. In the terms of decolonial scholars, we remain trapped under the colonial matrix of power, which encompasses basically the structures and patterns which were set up by the colonial machinery. The Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, in my view, was a reinforcement of the colonial machinery. The question may be asked, is there any significance for us to reflect on the legacy of the Berlin Conference 140 years later? As others will claim, let bygones be bygones. Focus on the present and the future. I guess it is hard to forget when the Democratic Republic of Congo is in a state of turmoil. Or as others will say, we have had enough of the emotional blackmail by Africans blaming the Europeans or the West for their own failures in the present. I guess it is simple for others to say when the scars and the lingering pains should go away. Or as others will say, stop whining. Anyway, pre-colonial Africa did not have the economic and political institutions to facilitate growth and development. I guess for those, one can simply say, who is to judge what we could have done when we had a chance to develop in our own terms. Or as others will say, be thankful for the civilization that colonialism brought to Africa. Do we have a reason to be thankful? The Berlin Conference was not the beginning of colonialism. It was a reinforcement of the colonial machinery. That conference focused on Africa, her people, and her resources for the use of European nations. This was a conference about Africa without Africans for the benefit of Europeans. Thus, when we deal with the impoverishment of Africa, as Walter Rodney argued years ago in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the question is who and what is responsible for the impoverishment of Africa? The answer that he gives in that book is clear. It is in the title. It is the European imperialists or colonialists who are responsible. While that is true, it does not mean that as Africans we do not critically look at ourselves, yet our critical assessment of the self does not absolve the other. The fact remains that Africa would not have been impoverished the way that it has been if it were not for colonialism and the reinforcement by the Berlin Conference. Prior to this conference, the explorers, capitalists, and settlers who laid claim to Africa and to African territories exploited the continent. It was for economic reasons that they came, and they had short-term and long-term goals. In these explorations of theirs and in these takeovers of the land, they had the blessing and the justification of the church. It was in the name of God that explorers and settlers armed with the doctrine of discovery will immediately and automatically grant themselves property, political power, and commercial rights over the newly discovered world and their inhabitants. In my context, the South African context, the takeover of the land was violent, and it eventually resulted in 93% of the land owned by the minority white, whereas the majority, the indigenous people, only owned 7% of the land by 1910. This was slightly revised afterwards to 13% of land ownership. And today, when a bill is introduced or an act is there about expropriation of land with nil compensation, issues are raised. The other thing is the enslavement of African people, which was ongoing even before the Berlin Conference. Now, it took two forms: slave trade and also enslavement in the land. Now, the colonial machinery has a way of adapting to changes. At first, it was the slave trade, trading in human beings. Over 20 million Africans shipped from the continent, underdeveloping Africa. When that seemed not to serve them anymore, the strategy had to change. We don't have to trade in human beings anymore. And that's what the Berlin Act of 1885 deals with. Let's not trade in human beings. Let's enslave them in the land. This machinery in the Congo Basin, it internationalized the space. It was free for all the colonizing nations to trade there. which implied that no one will be charged taxes or levies on the activities that they will be doing in that area. Even if the taxes were paid and the levies were made, it was not going to be for the benefit of the African people. The conference reinforced the principle of effective occupation, effective colonization, and therefore it meant direct rule had to be enforced. And here are some of the implications of the direct rule. First, it entailed political control over territories, and such control superseded any structure which was there. This meant our people, all of a sudden, found themselves having to be judged by laws not their own, overridden by laws not their own. Second, it implied that the colonizing state controlled the raw materials. They were no longer in control. Third, it implied a hierarchical and paternalistic relations that are now established. The colonizers had powers over the indigenous people, their preservation, care, moral, and material well-being. What it basically implied that they had the power to colonize their minds. Fourth, this conference accelerated the partitioning of Africa. The partitioning was already happening. It was simply the reinforcement of the partitioning. And this is the legacy that I live with. Africa remains partitioned along colonial lines. Or as Adebayo frames it, we live with the curse of Berlin as it legitimized the scramble of Africa. The Berlin Conference aimed to avoid conflicts amongst the colonizing nations, not conflicts amongst us. The resources exploited from Africa through colonialism have not served the African people. It's still, and we find ourselves impoverished. We live with colonial identities as westernized Africans. I am a South African. I don't know what that means, because I have an identity. I am Muvenda. I'm not a South African. It is a colonial identity that I live with. Colonialism, direct form of colonialism is over, but yet coloniality remains. The structures, the patterns remains, which keeps us entrapped. As decolonial scholars will say, and I am trying here to paraphrase Maldonado Torres, and I will say it is maintained, the colonial structures are maintained in AI tools, in platforms of learning, in cultural patterns, in the self-image of oneself, and in our own aspirations. In a way, as Maldonado Torres states, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. The structures of the colonial powers remain intact. I should say, I am going to simply highlight three which keeps us entrapped. Number one is what we call sanctions. Sanctions, it's the control of trade. Now, the Berlin Conference was about trade, trading in Africa, and the control of trade still remains with them. When sanctions are imposed on the third world countries or the underdeveloped countries, it means that those nations are greatly affected by such sanctions. The partners are reduced, trading partners. The GDP of those countries declines, which impacts the socio-economic factors of the country. There are several countries in Africa which are under sanctions as we speak. Zimbabwe, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, the CAR, DRC, Libya, Niger, amongst others. Zimbabwe, which is our neighbors, for many years now has been under sanctions following its accelerated land reform program of the early 2000s. The sanctions have resulted in the decline of the Zimbabwean economy, leading to the brain drain in Zimbabwe. As people seek greener pastures in other countries. The other form of control is overthrow of governments. To overthrow governments in Africa, the former colonial powers use their international instruments to create a narrative to justify their invasion and overthrow of foreign governments. Such interventions tend to send those countries on a downward spiral. The case of Libya is the one that we can point to. Outside of Africa, the case of Iraq is another one that we can point to. What happened to Libya can also happen to South Africa. The narrative has been generated. South Africa is committing genocide against Afrikaners, and therefore necessitating the USA to give them a free passage to the United States. And there are Afrikaners who have already departed, and they are in their new home in the USA. What it simply means is that South Africa, if the Afrikaners had responded, and that's my reading of the narrative, if they had responded in large numbers and vacated the land, the next logical thing to do was to overthrow government. That is my simple reading of the situation. The narrative does not have to make sense. The world can say whatever it says, but who can stop them if they are about to overthrow your government? The other thing is monopoly of military powers. The nations which wield military power have the ability to control things at the global stage. The 5 countries that have veto powers, who can touch them? Who can do anything to them? A weak Africa serves them. In actual fact, it is their military base of these countries. They have bases in Africa. An Africa that cannot protect its own territory remains open to exploitation. Former colonial powers continue to exert influence through military and security arrangements, often framed as partnerships of stability. These arrangements can entrench dependency and limit the autonomy of African states. Unfortunately, for as long as Africa remains weak militarily, it cannot deliver its people from the impoverishment that others have caused. An Africa that is always at war with itself cannot be a safe haven for its own people. Of course, we cannot simply point fingers to others. We also point fingers at ourselves. corruption is also impoverishing Africa. The current impoverishment of Africa has to do with the failures within, the failures of our leaders. The Chinese have the proverb which says a fish rots from the head, meaning that corruption usually starts with those in leadership and it spreads. In my own language, we have a proverb that is similar, which says, Tobere atudza na baranda ba atudza. Basically, it means if the king starts limping, the subjects also start limping because they see their leader limping. Now, the limping which we see in Africa starts with the leaders. What is impoverishing Africa? It is the neo-patrimonialism, that is a political system characterized by connections between leaders and the people or patrons or clients. Such a political system, as some scholars argue, is marred by poor governance due to the following, amongst others. First, the failure to implement even policies that you have in place. Second, it is the patrimonial politics, a system in which politicians and the bureaucrats find a way to channel state resources towards their own self-enrichment rather than the improvement of the nation. The politics of favor. The reasoning here is that the political culture in Africa is characterized by scratch my back and I scratch yours. This is the mentality which is there amongst our politicians and our people in the exchange of gifts. And of course, failure to hold people accountable. When individuals and leaders are not held accountable, they impoverish the nation and they go unpunished. In my context, my South African context, projects in some instances have to be done not once, not twice, but a number of times. And all those times, money is sniffled out of the state coffers, impoverishing our people. The call for Africa solutions to African problems, it's a worthy call. But is it yielding results? Corruption is subtle and undermines the systems and institutions that are there to hold people accountable, resulting in the enrichment and protection of the few. Moving forward, what do we do? The Berlin Conference was promulgated in the name of God, the Almighty. Is our response going to be just us speaking? Or do we have to invoke the name of God Almighty in our response? As we invoke the name of God Almighty, do we approach it in an African way of reversing the curse? Now, in our culture, some of us, when you are bewitched, you also consult and you send back whatever was brought to you. It goes back to the sender. They receive it. Is that the approach? That is an approach of hatred, which will not help us address and build as we move forward as Africans. In my view, what we need is decolonial justice at this point. A justice which requires us as Africans to unite, a divided Africa is a weak Africa. We will continue to be weak if we continue simply with the structures that have been set up for us. Second, decolonizing of knowledge, reclaiming our own wisdom and educational systems. I have been trained in Western forms of knowledge and paradigms. I'm a westernized being. And part of the thing that I have to do on myself is to unlearn the things that I have been taught in order to relearn what was lost. Of course, we also need government reform, building transparent and accountable governments is what we need in our context. And that is urgent, and the holding of people accountable cannot be delayed any longer. And yes, we need equitable partnerships, which implies that we have to renegotiate at an international level and not stick with the partnerships that continue to impoverish Africa. In the name of God, my hope is that we will overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've actually spoken less than the 30 minutes that was assigned to you. We were talking about, okay, do I now send you a message to say that you have 5 minutes more? But I thank you so much for your inspiring presentation. You have helped us, to walk with you from asking the question, what is impoverishing Africa? Looking at before Berlin, during the Berlin period, and during our own leadership. And so where are we when it comes to answering this question? And I'm hoping that, when it's time for conversation, you help us. We'll hear from people, and then you also guide us after you have received, the response from others. But it was a very powerful presentation. So let's give him another clap.
It's my pleasure to introduce to us this afternoon our keynote speaker for this in the second half of the session. Ms. Yvonne Apio Brendle Amolo. Our keynote speaker is a Swiss parliamentarian representing the Social Democratic Party. She serves as an executive member of the party's migrant section and advocates within the anti-discrimination and sexual harassment sector. As an advocate for minorities, she founded and chairs the Global Minority Parliamentarians Caucus and the Pan-African Women's Association. Ms. Brendle is a recipient of the inaugural Jamhuri Diaspora Awards 2024 from the Kenyan government. The inaugural 2024 Humanitarian Award for her engagement and fight against social injustice in Europe, and a 2019 United Nations Fellowship of Person of African Descent recipient. And now what I think is rather interesting as well, in 2020, Ms. Brendle Amolo joined the Swiss military, becoming an active officer in their civilian service sector, advocating for migrant women in the medical and care fields. Her short film, Not Swiss Made, has won 22 prizes in 4 continents up to date. In 2021, she co-curated, the art projection Frauenmünster 21, celebrating the 50th anniversary of women's federal voting rights in Switzerland, and was pivotal in ensuring the participation of women of African descent in exhibitions on Zurich and Switzerland's colonial histories, which included her artwork, The Most Disrespected Woman is the Black Woman. In 2023, she was a panelist at the United Nations 53 Human Rights Session on gender-based violence in public and political life. We are looking forward to your presentation on the global persistence of anti-Black racism and the role of the church. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I was not expecting that you would actually out me like that, especially the military part, but I can deal with it. Thank you very much also to the World Council of Churches for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here to speak to you. We have heard about the Berlin Conference. I don't need to tell you any more about that. That would be preaching to the choir. We have heard about mostly how it affects Black and brown people in Africa. So I'm going to try and tell you how it affects Black and brown people in Europe, because that is something I think we haven't heard about. And I hope I am in the capacity I have the capacity to speak to you about that today. Muvenda just spoke and said he's not African. Identify him by his name. And that really touched something with me, because as you can see, and I can see some of you are doing the same, you're wearing your clergy collars. I try, when I go out to speak, especially on people of African descent, to remind myself that although I am also a PO, I have to represent Africa, especially in the very white spaces I go to, because, like he rightly said, that was a colonial aspect, name, and that is how they identify us. So to be able to break that down, I have to first identify as African, then identify as a PO. Thank you for the reminder. The colonial persistence of anti-Black racism and the role of the church. Every once in a while, I will look at my notes because this is a very sensitive subject for me and some of you. So I need to be reminded not to forget everything I want to say. I will rush through the first slide. Please, the next one. Because these are some of the things you already know. Here we see the historical complicity of the church. And as you can see, and you know about it, it left a lot of lasting impact on the Black community. Then we see the contemporary challenges. And here we see there are subtle forms of racism that have manifested themselves in the religious institutions. Don't worry, I will talk about them later. Then we see the racial diversity caps. And here we see that many churches lack representation. And when I say representation, I mean people of African descent, Black people, brown people like me, in high positions, in leadership positions in the church. We will talk about how that affects people. And this lack of diversity can perpetuate a lot of the sense of exclusion and marginalization exactly among these people. Then we see the resistance to change in these institutions. Some churches resist to acknowledge the systemic racism that is past, but still going on, within their institutions. We will talk a little bit about that. Then we will see the call for reconciliation, Yeah. And here we see the persistent anti-Black racism and how the demands for a collaborative response, which we have heard about today, during the morning and now from Movenda, we see how addressing these past failures, from the church can contribute continuously to the racial equity and human dignity, the lack of it. Next slide, please. So, yes, the historic involvement of the churches in operation. Here, I will also just quickly go through it. The missionary discourse. We see that during the missionary times, those who went to Africa wrote back and sent messages about pagan Africa. And up until now, most people think we have decolonized a lot of this. Most people don't know that they really cemented this thought and this perspective of Africa. The white lens is still very, very prominent in how the church institutions see Africa. So this, at that time, stereotypes that they placed on Africans are still very much persistent in the religious institutions. Then we see the legacy of slavery. And with the legacy of slavery, we know that the church had a lot to do. Let's say, for example, with apartheid in South Africa, and we have discussed that. And some churches, they promote education so people can learn about that. Some churches, knowingly or unknowingly, continue to perpetuate these harmful stereotypes. So several churches, some people don't know this, and I think I'm here preaching to the choir, I really hope not, hold a lot of artifacts. People think only the museums, like the ones you visited today, hold those artifacts. But there are a lot of churches that do that, especially in Switzerland, where I am. Unfortunately, right now, I'm not really at the liberty to tell you which churches, because I know them, but if you dig, you will find them yourselves. So the legacy of slavery is not just what happened and that museums are holding these artifacts. Churches are holding them too. So when we talk about decolonization and we talk about restitution and all of that, we would really like the church to join into this and speak openly about really the weight of that legacy of slavery. Then we will look at the George Floyd protests. I have never been grateful for a demonstration like I am for the George Floyd protests, because much as a lot of the political discourse was and still is dictated by the US, also some of the things that happen to Black and brown people are dictated by what happens to the US. And we saw how the whole protest started there and came down to Europe. And now, speaking specifically about Switzerland, I have never seen such a huge protest for Black and brown people. And the fact that in Zurich especially, we were, I would say, maybe about 200-300 Black and brown people who had the guts and the nerves to walk on the street. But what really amazed me, and every time I still think of that, I get really emotional and I could cry, is because we had very young white people making a circle around us as we walked through the streets. I have never experienced such allyship as I did because of the George Floyd protests. And when I think of that, I think it was nice to see a priest in the US kneel down with the Protestants. There was a picture taken, it was all over the social media. It would be nice if more churches, especially in Europe, would give out a statement. You don't have to come to the protest. Give out a statement when such things happen. Because if you're looking for George Floyd incidences, you don't have to go to the States. We have enough of them in Europe. And some of them are just as bad. In Switzerland, we have a guy from Eritrea who was shot 15 times by the police. I don't know how he survived. He's still alive. He can't use half of his body because of the shots, but he goes through things like having the social system writing threatening letters and telling him if he doesn't go to work 90%, they're not going to pay any money for him to get his medical treatment. Now, in such incidences, if the church stepped in, we are not saying take over the bills, but if they said something, we all know how the system works. If the church says something, that's something huge. So those are the examples where we hope the church could step in. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, I already went a little bit there, so I'm going to talk to you now about the present day manifestations of the anti-Black racism in Europe. Microaggressions. I took my time, and I'm lucky that I know enough Black clergy that I could speak about this in the church. They are very subtle, extremely harmful. They range from different things. My favorite example is when a clergyman was told, after he preached a few times in the church, that they were disappointed with the way he was holding the Mass because they expected him to be more loud, more joyful, something like Men in Black. Yes, we are African. Yes, we are Black. Yes, we are loud and proud. But exactly like Movenda said, most of you learned what you're preaching and teaching now from Western schools. And when we go to school, we school the hell out of those books. So we will do exactly what you taught us, and we know how to live our behavior and our culture, which I am now showing you, behind, so that we get the job done. There is a time and a place for everything. Even we understand that. The next one, number 2. Divided church stances. This is a delicate one. We saw this during the apartheid. A lot of churches were not sure whether they really wanted to talk about the church's involvement in apartheid because of the economical ties they would lose, the money. Yes, okay. Unfortunately, we're seeing that now again because, and now I have to look to say the right name. For example, when there was a recent Vatican dicastery for the doctrine of faith, there was a lack of synodality, apparently. And although most people don't think that Black people follow the church and the church news that much, we do, even politicians like me. So when that shows up, the lack of unity in the church, it makes Black and brown people who are already having a hard time trusting the church lose even more trust in the church, So it really has a lot of impact on how we think you can deal with racial justice. Number 3, infantilization, which happens a lot apparently in the churches. The Black clergy, like I said, went to your schools. So they do have the qualifications to do the same jobs you're doing, And this we see by the lack of representation in the leadership roles. Right now, I would say the Catholic Church, maybe not only the Catholic Church, but I know about the Catholic Church, is getting a lot of clergymen from Africa. Getting them from Africa and having them come here is all well and good. We love to come here and preach, but then let them do the job. Just wanting our blues and not our pain does not work. And quoting a lot of us and a lot of our sayings and a lot of our proverbs is all well and good, but let them do the work. So there we are, as a Black and brown community, think we are experiencing a new form of cultural colonization from the Western imperialism. I know I'm a bit direct, haven't learned to be that Swiss yet, where I'm more diplomatic, but hey, I'm at that age where I'm not sure I have to learn that. The next one. The racial, no, go back, sorry, one more. Yes, thank you. Racial justice advocacy. Here, I would seriously plead for the church's help here. When I was introduced, it was mentioned that I do sometimes have a lot to do with migrants, and that's migrants from, every culture, not just Black and brown. But with the Black and brown people, we're seeing an increase, at least in Switzerland, of both women and men experiencing domestic violence from their Caucasian partners. Now, the one place I would think anybody who's Black and brown would find solitude and would feel safe is the church. But then again, if that happens to me, when I come to the church to ask for a safe haven, I would like to talk to somebody who looks like me, because then I feel safe to really say what is going on, especially because of those stereotypes. When a Black man walks into a church, he doesn't want to tell a white man, my wife is beating me up. Who's going to believe him because of the stereotypes? This is where I'm pleading with you, it would really help, because I have my hands more than full. There's only so much I can do. And people like me who are in politics, there's only so much we could do. So if we could work with the church, that would really, really take more than a load off our shoulders, and actually may bring you more congregation, if you think about it. Next slide, please. The role of the Black churches in Europe. We see, because like I already told you about the lack of leadership, diverse leadership in most of the churches in Europe, people are always wondering why, for example, in most European countries, our largest Black congregation, in most of them, not in every, is the Nigerian community. And then we have the Eritrean or Ethiopian community. And I'm always being asked, why do they go somewhere and then start their own church? Well, if they don't feel welcome in some of the churches that are here, that they are used to going to at home, and they still want to pray to their gods, they are going to start their own church, especially if they feel like some of their customs and traditions are not understood. They're going to start their own church. And we see that this really is working in very positively in some places, because, for example, like in Amsterdam, now I'm already in the second part, the community support is really, really amazing from these churches that have been started by the priests and the clergymen and women who were brought from Africa. They have a hub in Amsterdam where actually it's doing so well that the government also reaches to the hub when they want to have a discussion about a sensitive traditional topic or a sensitive cultural topic that affects Black and brown people. And this hub works also really closely with other churches in Amsterdam to help the Black and brown community. So that is just as a result as from Black and brown people still not yet feeling so safe in the churches. Historical complicity. I was so excited when I heard about the African Study Bible. I was so excited. Now, this African Study Bible, the fact that some people still don't know it exists is a pity. The fact that it's because it's not yet that popular, still so expensive, and cannot be given to a congregation, but a clergyman could possibly have it and preach from it, I also find such a pity. But then again, the church has to want it to exist more than it does right now. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Racial justice advocacy, I'll give you another example because I already spoke about this before. And this is racial justice advocacy that goes a little bit outside the normal church bubble. We had some shooting in Zurich, where I live, in a mosque. And I was so impressed that when we asked around, a church, St. Joseph's Church in Zurich, agreed to have the Muslim brothers and sisters come and pray and have their prayers in the church, while where the shooting was barricaded out by the police, put out of bounds. And just that was such a powerful signal. Exactly. Was such a powerful signal. Such collaborations could really, really help. And like I said, the church doesn't have to go out and do a protest. The Black church seems to have a prophetic voice. And I think it's because most of the Black clergy, when they're in the Black church, they don't feel the weight of having to conform to certain ways of talking, to certain things they have to say. And there they're able to really talk to the congregation, especially about the things that are going on. I know a few churches that have actually held such things like talks on FGM, female genital mutilation, because it's affecting the congregation. By the way, it does affect the migrant community quite a bit in Europe. And there, they can talk openly about it, but they can also talk in a challenging way about it because, and I can say this also because I did work as a TOR for some time, Technical Operations Assistant. It is difficult to ask of a community to stop a certain practice like female genital mutilation when you have Caucasian women going into a clinic to have what they call vaginal rejuvenation, which is just the first stage of FGM because there are 3 stages. So if we want to have an eye-level talk about this, we have to really talk about both sides of it before we get a culture that has been practicing something like that to even want to listen to us. We also have to change the languages of how we speak about it because depending on which stage it is, some of them don't see it as mutilation. Next slide, please. So I just put out a few things and areas where I thought it could be beneficial and it would help if they were touched upon. The role of education and awareness, anti-racism training. It sounds lighter than it is. It's not that easy to do. Believe me, I have tried. So ongoing education, it's really vital, but not just ongoing education for individuals, because every once in a while I go to a church and I meet this super clergy person, Caucasian, who has done all the training and they're really good at it. But if it is one person and then there's the whole church there, it doesn't really help that much, you know. So I would say it would be good if it was not just for individuals, but a way where the whole staff kind of do it. And I have done this also with companies that say, if we call you in for anti-Black racism training, it's like we are admitting we have a problem. So give it another name, but teach the right stuff. That works all the time. Call it a training on ethics if you want. Call it whatever you want, but do the work, do the training. Critical self-reflection. I'm hoping you just did that before your lunch. you were asked to by the people who organized that. So I'm not going to I don't have to touch on that. I'm assuming you had critical reflection, especially about the very wide narratives out there. Safe discussions. Once again, thank you for inviting me here, because this is a safe space, for me at least. I hope it is for you as well. So I'm trying to use this safe space, which you have given me, to say some of the things that we really need you to hear. And I am hoping that you're receiving it in a very welcoming way. Ongoing education, anti-Black racism is always changing. The resources are always changing. Right now, we have somebody who's getting rid of the books, getting rid of the education, getting rid of God knows what. It just has to be Black, it has to go. It's always changing. So we need to always keep the education going and find new ways of dealing and giving the education. Next slide, please. So I come to the conclusion, yay, I'm sure. So I already said the churches do not have to go for a protest. There are very many ways, different ways of protesting. I have given you some examples, so I don't have to go through that. Education for change, I have just mentioned that. We have to constantly keep the education, update the education. Addressing microaggressions. Here, the infantilization of Black clergy people is for me really a sore spot. So it would be good if that was looked into, and also allowing them maybe to be able to be eligible to do mass, baptize people, marriages, whatever they usually need to do. Support for the Black community. And this is really, really dear to me, because I'm going to now say something that is also very obvious. Action speaks louder than words. And this is my closing thought. So I said I come from Kenya. Everybody knows the song Hakuna Matata. All those words that begin with M, some which we don't want you to know, most people already know. So I decided to pick again 2 M's. So Hakuna Matata, let's put that aside. Action speaks louder than words. Matendo huongea kuzidi maneno. So, this is maneno. This is matendo. So, we'll keep it simple. Maneno, chini. Matendo, juu. Repeat after me. Maneno, chini. Matendo, juu. Maneno, chini. Matendo. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Madame Brendle Amoyo. It was very good for me, at least, I guess, for all of us to listen to you, to your personal statements, and at the same time to a very profound insight in the situation of people in the churches and the expectations you formulated for the churches in Europe. So we did not only hear from Switzerland and from their neighbor countries, but we also had a look at the United States, which is very important in these days, I guess. And I felt it was very helpful that you gave all these good examples of when cooperation is expected and helpful, and at the same time the self-criticism, which is also necessary for the churches in order to walk together into the future with other people of different background and color. I have a little problem now with the time, because our common session with our Facebook friends will end in almost 12 minutes. So I guess what we will do, we will open the plenary now for questions of understanding, and please have the courage to ask 1 or 2, 3 questions, which we will then deepen, and we will ask for answers from our key speakers, and then we will continue in the afternoon and in the days to come. Is this also okay for you? Yeah? Please come, maybe you join me, or so who has the first question? Please, can you stand up and say your name? Yeah, maybe you get a mic. Yeah.
Okay, my name is Makena. I have a question. Thank you so much to Professor Huli and Mheshimiwa Molo for the powerful keynote speeches. My first question goes to Professor Huli. When you're discussing what is impoverishing Africa, your point number 4 is corruption, a failure of our African leaders. My questions are the African leaders free? What happens to good people who get to power? Is it not a curated structure or system? And if so, what do we do about it? My next question goes to Mheshimiwa. You've said that when we're doing anti-racism training, sometimes we don't have to call it that way. Why should we not call it what it is? Is it not time to call a spade and not a big spoon? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to collect a few questions, and then we will invite the key speakers for the answer. Please.
My name is Suzanne from Zambia. My question is directed to the professor who spoke first. Actually, I'm thinking aloud. My sister here has already alluded to it. But I'm thinking, how did we lose the link between chieftainship and colonization? How come at independence, when we got our so-called independence, we did not stop to think about how we could go back to our own systems? And yet we create this big animal that sets the African continent back. And there's so much talk about corruption, so much talk about thieving, and all those ills about our leadership in our own countries. Where did we miss it? What is the missing link between how we governed ourselves, where we welcomed visitors? What happened to our Ubuntu, in short? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess there's space for another question. Now we got 2. Sorry for that. Maybe you start first, and then the other gentleman, and then we move into the answering round.
Yes.
Please.
I just would like to underline something. I am mostly hearing about symptoms, especially when it comes to the church or churches in their alliance with colonial powers. However, among the churches, there is, here I'm trying to make the difference between symptoms and root cause. It was among Christian churches and also among Muslims that was perpetrated the belief that was undergirding colonialism and slavery and so forth, that black people are cursed. And if we don't address those issues there to really emancipate the minds even of Africans, this myth will continue. There are 2 lingering myths. One is black people bear the mark of Cain. And second, black people are the descendants of Ham, so therefore they are cursed. And then, therefore, what we see today in Africa, extraction of minerals, riches, and then the sending of, for example, toxic waste and so forth, so on. So I think until we address the issue in depth, those wrong beliefs that Africans are cursed, and debunk that from Genesis 9 and so forth, we will continue to address the symptoms and not the root causes, basically.
Thank you. I will call you for the last question, but before I do this, I will address the global audience and would like to remember you that the next live streaming session will be tomorrow at 9 o'clock. We will continue over here for a few minutes, and it was great for all of us who joined us this morning and this afternoon. And if you need further information on the WCC, have a look at the Facebook and the events page. So good afternoon for all of you, and we can continue for a few minutes, please.
Just a brief question. York Rieger, Vanderbilt University. I have time tomorrow in the plenary to say more. Root causes and symptoms. For the professor, why are we talking about corrupting more so than corruption, more so than who's doing the corrupting, right? They're the corrupted, and there's a process of corrupting that might need to be addressed as well. And I'm curious what you would say about that. Thank you.
Okay, shall we ask our speakers, to respond to the questions? We'll start with Professor Ramatswana. There were quite a number of them, right? There's one on, actually 3 on corruption. Because the one on symptoms and root causes is still on corruption.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are our leaders free? That's the question. I would like to believe that they fought for something. That's what I would like to believe. They may not be, in some instances, the first generation of those who fought and conquered. But there was a sense of freedom. Of course, the game was rigged already because the systems were put in place. And so we were inheriting corrupt systems. And when we enter into corrupt systems, we have a responsibility to work on those systems so that they do not corrupt us. Now, if you are inheriting a system that was corrupt to the core, now these systems that we inherited, which were colonial, exploiting at a larger scale, you inherit it, you learn its systems, and you learn to take from the system as well. But our hope was that we will not be the same as the system was. That is at least our hope. Can we do better? I think we can do better, and our leaders can do better. Where did we lose the link? The system is seductive because it makes you look at it and think, this is it. We want this. And so there is a sense in which what we were fighting for was not so much liberation, but was accommodation. We wanted to be accommodated in the system. And when we want to be accommodated in the system, then we lose the link because we reinforce the system even over our own traditions. And that is what has happened. Can we still undo the system? Now, this is what I take from the Berlin Conference. If they put their mind on it, they will do it. That's what they did. If we are going to continue with the scramble and partition Africa. They did it. Do we have the will to do it? To get it done, to rethink the systems that we inherited and say, these systems, perhaps they are not working for us, let's devise a different system. The will to do it, the commitment to follow through. If it is there, it can be done. But is it there? That's the question. The corruption. I am using the word corruption because it allows for both the corrupt and the corrupting part and the one who is getting corrupted. So it speaks to both. But think about it. The wisdom that says if a leader limps, then the subject will limp. It can be also understood in another way. If the leader is not limping and realizes that the subject are limping, that leader has a responsibility to correct the subjects. But when it is starting from the leader, that's where the problem is. We are not saying leaders are not prone to being corrupted. They are, but they are also capable of resisting the corruption. And that is the least that we expect from our leaders. About the case, I guess it has to do with ideology. My take is that from our side, we stand for what is right, what we believe it is right, and hope that those who hold a different ideology at some point will realize the fallacy of their position.
Why don't we call a spade a spade? Are you Kenyan? Yeah. Straight on. See? Straight on to the point. No beating about the bush. I just want to know. Now, I agree with you, actually. And usually when I'm invited to speak about anti-Black racism, even when they call it another name, I come there with my slides written anti-Black racism. But I have, and yes, some of us do, the privilege of being able to do that without my life being in danger. I have been threatened, I'm getting used to it, but it hasn't gotten to the point where I think my parents who are still alive will receive the news and hear, because I was speaking about anti-Black racism, I'm no longer alive. So it is tactical. Not everybody can afford to do it, therefore. And especially now, I would agree and ask some people to do it because some people are also losing the funds which they need to be able to speak about the anti-Black racism. Without no funds, might as well stay at home, yeah? So in this case, yes, I'm hoping that we are getting to the point where we are coming together, organizing ourselves as Black people and brown people enough that we have enough funds that we don't have to rely on people who will dictate what we say and how we say it. We are not yet there. Until we are there, Kenyan to Kenyan, give us some grace. Because it is in the delivery, okay, that the message gets there. I had to learn also because of politics. It doesn't matter how I got there. If I gave you the message and you understood it, that's the important part. Yes. Pagan Africa. This is a myth. Yes, I agree, we need to debunk. It's time to learn that that is not the job of Black and brown people, because we didn't name ourselves Pagan Africa. Let the people who did debunk it, because we know we are not Pagan Africa, you know? That's why when people look at me and they're like, damn, you're a loud Black woman, African, I'm like, loud and proud, and there's nothing you can do about it, because I can't wake up today and wash myself and be white. So, I love, embrace, and work with what I've got. Yeah, so we would love to debunk the myth, wouldn't you? I'm sorry, I'm looking at this side of the room because that is where I have the most allies sitting. So, you know what to do. So, that's my response to debunking the myth. We could use names like Rising Up instead of anti-Black racism. I always try, and that is something I'm glad I have in me, even when really bad things happen, to look at it from a positive angle. So Rising Up, that still sends the message. I don't know, Courageous Conversations, that still sends the message. Oops, I seem to be dropping my Africanness one after the other. Think of something positive, call it what you want, but just get the message delivered. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the powerful presentations. I want to conclude, by saying that from what we heard earlier on the way forward that was presented by our professor here, what I understood is that you are asking us for a mindset change. Okay, that we need to look again at the way we are uniting among Africans. That yes, we are using these labels of Africa, Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania. Okay, they were given to us and we have our own, but then these labels also help us to come together as a continent and not as, individuals. So how do we then unite for change in Africa? And you said it very well that we also need to decolonize our knowledge system. It was very clear in your presentation that that's one of the things that we need to do, because our academic system itself is very colonized. And for us to change, we need new knowledge, as you rightly mentioned, and we need reforms in government that would use our indigenous systems. I've heard, people say very often that in Africa, we do have very nice policies, which we don't implement because they're not coming from a mindset position. So we produce knowledge that is not ours, but we need to produce knowledge which we can use to transform our ways of doing things. And I also heard very clearly from our second presenter that indeed, whether you are in Africa or you are in the diaspora, there are challenges, for everyone who is of a different color from those who are the owners of Europe. And that requires a new strategy, and one of which is what, she said to us, that, the churches have a role to play in this. And whether we are back home or we are in the diaspora, we need to unite for change also in the diaspora. And so I want to invite, my co-moderator to say the last words about what next.
So we have prepared a little gift for the keynote speakers, and we will hand it over now. And then afterwards, I will invite Masiwa for some housekeeping news But now, gifts first.
Yes.
I take one and you take one,
Yes.
and then we choose.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.